As a broad category in metaethics, cognitivism posits that moral statements express beliefs that can be true or false, thus allowing for objective moral facts. An example would be, it is wrong to torture and murder someone. Under cognitivism, this is a truth-apt statement, meaning there is some context in which it has truth value or can be true or false. Cognitivism asserts that morality is a real aspect of the world, which we are discussing. The nature of this morality can be quite broad under cognitivism, including, for example, the following very distinct views. First of all, moral realism, which states that moral facts are mind-independent. A slightly unique example, or a pretty common one, would be connected to God, but divine command theory, which suggests that God's will has a moral weight under which creation exists. 2. Moral subjectivism, which claims that moral truths pertain to mind-dependent attitudes or perceptions, but that those perceptions are real features of the world. 3. Error theory, an interesting one, which claims that ethical sentences express propositions, but that they are all false, whatever their nature, because morality is not an actual feature of the world. This sounds a bit weird, right? This will lead us into non-cognitivism and Alex O'Connor's recent emotivism, so bear with me for a moment. What does it mean in error theory to say there are no moral features of the world? An example, I don't believe in free will, so when I describe us as choosing things, I mean something other than free choice in the ultimate sense someone like Robert Cain might believe. If someone were to come along and say he chose truly freely to overcome his natural stupidity and become a genius, I would say, no, you're simply not a genius. You've just taught yourself more things with the mind you were born with and with its potential. Or you were always a genius. You just needed to actually study. Or you had a hard childhood, which blinded you to your potential until now. Or you happen to have a great teacher, or all of these things. The point is, I attribute everything that happens to external or pre-existing causal forces. When someone says he chooses something freely, then I recognize it as a proposition which attempts to truly describe some feature of the world, but I think it's false because I don't think free choice is a thing that exists, so I think it fails to describe the world. This is error theory. There are no moral facts, so when we try to describe them, we fail. They are false. Our descriptions are false. We are misunderstanding reality, but we are still making propositional statements. A simpler example, xenomorphs are dangerous. This is a proposition in that it tries to align with reality, only xenomorphs don't exist, so the proposition is false. There is nothing like a xenomorph that is dangerous. This leads us into non-cognitivism because you can say, instead of being false, that the proposition is not truth-apt, meaning it doesn't comment upon any sort of thing that can even be true. Because xenomorphs do not exist, the term is nonsensical, and therefore I'm not describing any sort of actual reality. This was a kind of shaky example. Let me explain. It bridges us on to non-cognitivism. Wasn't very good. Non-cognitivism suggests that moral statements are not propositions with truth value, but are instead kind of expressions of emotion, mere expressions of attitude, desire, etc. Perception is the key word, maybe. Consider the free will example again. When I say I choose to do this freely, I don't think we're really saying or correctly saying, I choose to do this in the way we think. We are instead expressing how we feel about the process. We feel happy, unconstrained, not compelled by anything outside of our brain to do anything our body, we did not want to do. Okay, now it sounds tricky or kind of weird saying this without actually using the word free choice because it's so deeply embedded in our language, which does mean something. It means we perceive ourselves as acting agents. But if I don't believe in free will, I don't think saying I choose to do this freely, I don't think it's a proposition at all, but rather simply an expression of kind of satisfaction or pride in my state here in society, in this world, and what I'm able to do, what I'm able to experience. So presenting these comparisons in this way, I hoped to kind of draw attention to the fact that a lot of this could be seen as confusion over language, not as much confusion over the actual structure of reality. I think one of the reasons emotivism has gone somewhat out of style, as Alex keeps saying, is that some thinkers simply started using other language. When we absorb a description like that of emotivism, all the words have associations or flavors or sort of weights in our minds. The words free will and morality are themselves evidence of this. What Alex really means is that morality is not a thing. It's no feature of the world. Then Sam Harris comes along and says something like this.
The way we have taught ethics and the way we've demarcated it from science and even from the rest of philosophy and the way we've internally divided it into consequentialism and deontology and virtue ethics, right? I think all of these boundaries tend to be misleading, right? And I think we can clean the slate, and we could in a purely descriptive way, which is to some degree where that tweet thread is pointing. You could say, let's just forget we even had this topic, ethics and morality and good and evil and value, and just forget about, let's just be truly naive as to what our circumstance is. We're clearly in a circumstance where there's a wide range of experience on offer, depending on what kind of mind you have. And a few things are true about this, which are clearly true, and I think clearly give us a realistic picture, a philosophically realistic picture of the space in which we are making various truth claims. One is...
So, are they disagreeing about what we ought to do? Well, not really. Alex is saying the word ought never had the sort of weight or nature we thought it might. We perceived the world wrong. Sam is coming back and saying, okay, but if we're going to talk about what we should do, the full extent of what we should do type of things, we will need a word. And words like ought and should and morality are the words we use. That's what we're talking about. So blah, 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 blah. He goes on to do his thing. So just keep this language bit in mind, because I think kind of the philosophical zeitgeist or opinions shift a lot because people are kind of reacting to the language games of previous people, adding their own instincts atop it, trying to kind of prod and poke from a new perspective, which means with new words. And it keeps evolving, but I'm not sure how much the actual root opinions evolve. Just keep this in mind. In the end, if there's no practical difference in the choices different thinkers advise, what is the real difference in their worldview? Just language utterly without consequence. Now, of course, language all too often does truly have consequence, but that's because it affects perception, motivation, action. If language differences don't have any measurable consequence, we can actually say they are meaningless, directly, literally. Okay, enough of my tedious language now. Let's tackle emotivism, which Alex has been touting a lot lately.
I do think that people should recognize the extent to which emotions dominate our ethical thinking. I mean, I think it's seen as a relatively eccentric view that ethics just is the expression of emotion. This was something popularized by that same A.J. Ayer in a book that was so troubling to the philosophical consensus at the time that people came to him and said, well, what about ethical statements? You can't prove these in principle and they're not tautological. And he said, well, the way that they're meaningful is that they are expressions of emotion. And it gives birth to this view called emotivism, which is really a philosophy of language more than a philosophy of ethics. It tries to describe what people mean when they say good or bad. And famously, he comes up with this analogy that saying murder is wrong is like saying boo murder. And saying murder is, or saying give to charity is good is like saying yay charity. It's just an expression of emotion. It's not even the same thing as saying I like charity or I don't like murder, because those things can be true or false. They have truth value. It could be true that it is just a psychological fact that I don't like murder. He means murder is wrong. That statement is just the expression of the emotion.
Yep.
Boo murder. And I think...
I'd say emotivism describes a pretty similar thing, the same thing as some form of utilitarian cognitivism. One just observes that subjective experience is, surprise, surprise, a subjective thing, while the other describes a bit more directly or maybe comprehensively the nature of the subjective, the way the subject must be. Let me explain. Non-cognitivism observes that we describe the subjective features of experience, not of the objective world. Cognitivism affirms the desire of the subject for a positive, say a preferential or pleasurable experience, an affirmation which to me is thoroughly impossible to refute, and it's thoroughly impossible to construct an action game, a worldview plan, whatever, that contradicts it. It's impossible to construct a worldview which at once affirms the subjective space of value and meaning while also contradicting the nature of preference or pleasure. Either you can deny the phenomenological completely, which I think is a hopeless venture, or you can affirm it, accept all that it entails, and accept that we must then have a conversation about how worldviews that ground the phenomenological will always include phenomenological language. We get confused because we feel like this throws the existence of the phenomenological into doubt. No, rather it exists in a subjective way. It is of a subjective essence. Bear with me, we will get confused by language probably, so I'll probably eventually swap out the words subjective and objective for other things. maybe a bit more rare words that can kind of stick in our minds intuitively or whatever. I will then point out that there are different categories of phenomenological things. There are things like pain, which for now simply exist without moral implication, but which grow kind of fuzzy at the edges as pain bleeds into discomfort or tickling or nervous tingling or then excitement and then ultimately pleasure. Any contention or disagreement about the nature of pain will depend on an individual's chosen spectrum of definitions, but that's contention about the words, the terms. That's not contention about what is actually being experienced. If you feel this thing, you feel this thing. If it's slightly more tingly because of your skin or more mild because you're tough or brings back some particular memory because of your experiences, then it's a different sensation. The experience of this is as it is, as it is, as it is. It grounds itself in the experiencing of it. It cannot be captured by words. Words are actually least capable of capturing these sorts of things. So, having this understanding of the phenomenological, I will point out that it's the only directly knowable, truly verifiable thing. Even the most objective things like numbers, the tautologies of logic, quarks and electrons, whatever, we can have some measure of doubt about them because maybe I think of a slightly different thing when I hear the number 1. Maybe I speak another language in which it means 2. Maybe I think of numbers as the literal shapes of the numbers drawn in my mind. Maybe I think of them like points. Maybe I just think of one thing, whatever happens to be closest to me, one microphone. Maybe I have such a powerful mind that I can actually conceptualize the abstract quantity of one, pure and unembodied somehow. Impossible, I'd say, which leads me to my point. Knowledge of the objective is always indirect, just as pure reason is always indirect. In the words of Jonathan Pageau, it's an abstraction. We don't experience reason, we experience this.
The problem with scientific thinking is that scientific thinking is very useful for, making planes fly and understanding the trajectory of a projectile or whatever, but it's actually secondary. It's a form of abstraction. We don't live in that world. We live in a world of experience. Nobody drinks H2O. That's ridiculous. Like you drink water and your experience of water is cold and wet. These are the experiences that we live in. And if we can get back into those experiences, then everything in religion is available to us again.
When it comes,
what is it to be rational? It's to take a step back, to separate ourselves from the flow of hormones and experiential perception in as much as possible, and it's to think of things as just this particle, this information bumping into this one, likelihood of outcome is theta x 29 degrees, but without a mind. Reason is just particles cascading, just things bumping about. That's not reason, that's just processing, information processing, material processing, whatever you want to call it. Reason emerges when a mind capable of other things engages in reason in as much as it is able. There are all these other things going on, like the intent, the sensation of thinking hard, and then the reason itself is the part of this that is an abstraction, the consideration going on in the mind. Or is it the sensation of the consideration? The point is, knowledge of the objective and rational realm is indirect and filtered through all this seeming. The only thing directly knowable is the seeming itself, the perception. And there are perceptions like black, like memories, which may or may not map onto the external world. Maybe the world is not black there, but maybe I just have my eyes closed. Maybe the memory isn't exactly accurate. I'm not perceiving the past thing, after all. I'm simply experiencing a mental reconstruction of something my brain kind of recorded in the past, experienced. So we can say this memory is inaccurate. We can say this perception of black is inaccurate. Suppose we hear someone say they perceive blackness. There are several possibilities. Okay, you and I are lost in a cave and looking for a way out. I've gone around a corner and I'm yelling back, "I see only blackness! The exit cannot be this way!" Now maybe I'm lying and I don't really see blackness. My perception and the material reality coincide, but I'm deceiving you, so the words and the perception animated in your mind do not coincide with the reality you desire. Maybe it's really sort of gray ahead, enough that you would investigate further because you think there might be light ahead. This is again an incompatibility of perception between you and me, a difference in understanding as to what sorts of shades of gray might indicate an exit. Or maybe I can't see such subtle shades as you can. Maybe I define blackness in a different way. This is simply a matter of definition. With each option, we see that the incoherence, any possible disagreement you could have with my statement, "it is black ahead," arises not from the actual essence of blackness, not from the actual nature of the cave, but in what is perceived and transmitted through language. Wow. Okay. I'm here editing and things are wild. Well, so basically, how did this even come about? I was writing a lot about my just general worldview, morality. The last time I wrote about morality and free will was years and years ago when I was still grappling with my interpretation of the Bible. I was still very much determined to be a Christian, and I was grappling with what sort of interpretation of God in the Bible I could have. So it has been quite a while, and that was a lot of just kind of armchair thinking. I was just kind of working things through in my mind. I did read like snippets and excerpts of primary sources, but I have branched out far from there. And I mean, recently I've been reading a lot more primary sources, but probably more focused on existentialism. Yeah, the continental philosophers, a lot more kind of mingling up with poetic literary mythology. Pragmatism. I love pragmatism. So the point is, I was going through old notes. This was kind of triggered most recently probably by Sam Harris and Alex O'Connor's podcast, in which I was like, oh yeah, I used to have thoughts about that and I could probably articulate myself better now. And then, I went through a long journey and I've, started more meditation, more focus on consciousness phenomenology, which has led me to all this stuff about perception and the narrative framework, which, sounds very Petersonian, but also me as a storyteller, kind of the other part of this channel being focused on story, fairy tale, myth, religion. So that kind of led me to, a more recent focus I've had on perception and the very concepts the structure that makes us up determines in a very fundamental way, the sorts of concepts, the essence of our existence. It's not just that matter is constructing things and then we draw the boundaries. It's that the sorts of things we see, the sorts of experiences we have are dependent on perception. And that's nested in, I believe fully in material law, natural law, but consciousness brings this phenomenological aspect. So I was kind of rambling and tangenting, and I was originally trying to do a more analytical breakdown, following from the beginning of this video, cognitivism, non-cognitivism, the little PowerPoint thing I put up. I was going to do a more analytical breakdown of emotivism. I was going to draw on quotes and stuff from Alex, but I didn't. I kind of rambled. I ended up focusing a little bit more on phenomenology in this video, and I don't know what I'm going to do because I have now like 6 or 7 working thought pieces or documents, and it's a very kind of just flow of thought. And I'm not sure if it's going to be addressing Alex specifically too much. So I will keep the title as it was originally intended because I need those clicks. And I mean, I am addressing, and I think you'll be able to connect the dots, and it's addressing most freshly his expressed views from the last, year, 8 months or so. But I just wanted to put this in, say, tell me if it's too repetitive, if it's too slow. I was trying to build up something kind of methodically, and I ended up having all these layers, each with a slightly different focus. I'm thinking of releasing one next week on Materialism nihilism and the idea that there are no things and how we perceive of things and, the kind of ontological status of those perceptions. Remember that the perception of blackness is as it is, as it is. It's there, existing in my mind. Maybe my eyes are closed. Maybe they're not as sensitive to color, whatever. Any disagreement between us derives from our perceptual structure or our language transmission, not from the experience itself of blackness. Now let's plug in pain and pleasure. Pain and pleasure cannot be denied. If I say I don't want to be slapped like this, it is an expression of an attitude or a preference. Alex is right about this. But what sort of thing is a preference? A preference is that which cannot be otherwise. That which is preferred or desired is that which, when experienced, confirms itself as the object of preference or desire. This is where we feel like this doesn't ground it or prove it in some objective way. We're so used to debating things in the empirical, the material science realm. We feel frustrated here, but any possible contradiction you can mount must appeal to the same phenomenological language. Think about this. This is where I say we must first affirm the concrete existence of the phenomenological. In order to dismiss a preference or prop up another in its place, you must embrace the phenomenological, and in embracing it, you affirm its legitimacy. A preference is either non-existent or it is untouchable, but it cannot be overturned by a description of mere matter, of anything that exists in the objective space alone. This is what Sam Harris means when he says, anything goodness can ever mean, any sense in which it can ever be a concept at all, must have to do with well-being. Or, in the words I or Alex have been using, preference. Sam is just pointing out that there's no way to reject a preference without rejecting its actual ontology, its actual existence. Okay, I don't think I'm describing this the best. Let's consider this. Do I want to experience this pain? Maybe I do, because it helps me illustrate this point. The pain is minimal, and it's worth the pleasure of better conveying my point. So what I preferred or desired wasn't really to avoid the pain of being slapped, but to avoid the pain of being slapped in a scenario in which there is no pleasure that outweighs the pain. The deep fulfillment I find in conveying my point and publishing this video is far more pleasurable than the avoidance of being slapped. So preference is preference is preference. It is that which, when experienced, is desired more. Now here Alex would say something like, "That's all well and good, Jesse," in his British accent, but I'm not trying to reject the nature of preference. I agree preference is. But I'm saying preference is simply an emotional state. It's simply particles flowing, creating this experience in consciousness. It has no imperative weight. But I say, what are we really discussing when we say something like imperative weight? When we discuss morality, we're discussing how the world is and what, therefore, we should do in it. Now, this is part of that world. We get kind of circular here because I just appealed to the idea of should, what we should do in it. I think at this point, you really just get down to some level of brute reality, experience. The subject can only ever experience well-being as well-being, and in some, say in utilitarian sum, the net well-being of conscious creatures is self-evidently meaningful, is the only dimension in which positive meaning or its opposite can ever exist. Yeah, I am going in circles here. You just have to experience it to affirm it. Let's swap the words around a bit for clarity. Let's take subjective and objective out of the equation. Let's say blackness exists concretely, but in perspectival way. That is to say, it exists objectively, but it's a subjective sort of thing. It appears in the mind of a subject. Apples exist concretely and in a material sort of way. That's to say, they exist objectively in an objective sort of way. Kind of, because the things that make up an apple are interpreted as an apple by us. But I won't go into that again except to remind us the material, the rational, they're less directly knowable than the phenomenological. The concept of Superman, say, exists concretely, but Superman as such does not exist concretely. So we have material things versus perspectival things, and we have concrete existence or simply non-existence. We don't need another word for the sort of existence which occurs neither concretely nor in the mind, because those things don't exist at all. This would be like the concept of oh, except it exists now because I've said it. So whatever happened in your mind, that was a real, meaningful pattern lit, animated into being. So we've swapped out the words in this way. Before we would have said something existed objectively like an apple or subjectively like the concept of Superman or the concept of an apple. We also would have said you could make statements of objective truth such as, this is what in English we call an apple, and statements of only subjective truth such as, this apple is sweet. But Sam's point here is that these are dealing with different realms, different applications for the words subjective and objective. These refer to how things are in being. An apple is an object. Superman is a concept. These refer to how things appear in the subject or constructed space. We call this an apple because of language, because we have this category of things we call apples, and so on. Now, that's a true observation of how apples exist, but it depends on subjective being. Saying this apple is sweet depends on the subject category apple, and then also makes further subjective claims regarding the sweetness in my particular mouth. This claim to sweetness may not be true for any other human, yet the claim to appleness will, as long as we share the language, the history, the category perception, and so on. The claim to appleness will be a true claim regarding reality and what it means to us. So it's correct to say that this is an apple. It's correct to say that it's sweet if it produces sensations of sweetness in enough mouths to be functional. If I'm serving apples at a wedding and they ask me to serve only sweet ones, my perception and language have to have sufficient alignment with the rest of the human perception and language. We can say, I'm correct to serve apples that are perceived as sweet. Now, if we say serving these apples is good, is that a preference? Or is a description of me having successfully aligned with all the others to produce the sort of existence we all prefer? Okay, rewind. Let's just keep in mind that we have these different words now to avoid confusion over the subject-object dichotomy. An apple exists concretely in a material way. A perception of sweetness exists concretely, but in a perspectival way, meaning it's dependent on my unique structure. Where there's enough structural overlap to serve apples everyone experiences as sweet, we are concretely successful, using concretely useful or accurate language. But this is measured in terms of our perspectival experience of sweetness. I would say that if ought is to mean anything, if morality is to mean anything, it clearly must pertain to this phenomenological perspectival space. The only beings morality can apply to are beings rather than things, beings that experience and choose things in some way or another. Consider a brain in a vat, subject to endless torture without any agency of any sort. It's not acting as a moral agent. Now, what is being done to it, though, in what way could we describe this as immoral? We could describe it as immoral by first acknowledging that there's a plane of experience and that there's some alternative to the endless torture, and that whoever's imposing the torture on the brain, that person or thing, can be or is an experiencing agent with the choice, the option to choose differently. Then we would have to go about describing why that person could choose another sort of action, why that sort of action could be perceived as better, and so on. To do this is to affirm the concrete existence of the phenomenological, and to affirm the concrete nature of pain as well. Pain is pain is pain. It is that thing which, when experienced, is not preferred. So someone says it's immoral to torture the brain in the vat, and I come along and say, hey, a more moral world might be one in which you do torture the brain in the vat. Now, why? I'm going to have to appeal to this phenomenological plane. But Alex is saying there simply is no moral plane. Consider the free will debate, or the God debate for that matter. Alex thinks about it and comes to the conclusion that free will is an incoherent idea. There's no way it can make sense. There's information processing. It follows this causal chain. Sensations emerge. We desire things and pursue them, some on the level of the conscious and some below it, and never in that process is there an agent somehow imposing itself downward upon the process without itself emerging from or being caused by the various moving parts. So Alex, and me also, come to the conclusion that not that free will doesn't work in this way, but that there is no free will. Will does not work in this way. The idea is incoherent. And then we can move along to describe the sorts of things that do govern our world and what we experience in it. Causality, what things we can choose, subconscious versus conscious levels of cognition, hormones, environment, language. And you can piece them together and you get something emergent which does align with reality, like determinism, say, or does not, like libertarian free willism. In the same way that he denies the coherence of free will, Alex is denying the coherence of this moral plane. We can affirm the nature of preference, but he's saying we cannot weight it with an ought. I would ask, though, if morality is meaningful, what is it? Accepting the utilitarian aim for now, we ought pursue course of action which produces the most preferred outcome. Whether that's for the most people or just the most outcome period, we don't need to go into for now. For now, we're just connecting morality to this concrete reality of the phenomenological. We've established that sensation exists concretely. We've established it grounds itself as the only directly knowable thing. We know it's nested in or dependent on the natural material processing around us. So the only remaining question is, why does my preference and yours all differ? And what about when they come into conflict? That's the place conflicts of morality emerge. So that's where morality becomes important to discuss, meaningful. Alex is saying we can't impose one preference over another because there's no external point from which to weigh the sensations against one another. But I'm saying the only statements that can ever possibly have meaning in this realm, the realm of preference and what we want to do, are statements that affirm the existence of sensation. Good is good is good. And as sensation is arising in minds, we simply need to calculate how the minds overlap or fail to overlap. And thankfully, we do have some idea as to why minds and sensations conflict, and how. Back to determinism. We are products of this material processing. We share brain structures. We report the same set of basic experiences and causal factors. We can then use language to communicate our preferences meaningfully to one another. Remember the blackness in the cave. To the degree communication produces an undesired end, it is a problem of language or perception of the world, not a problem of direct phenomenological perception. There is no problem of phenomenological perception. There can be no incoherence of pain or pleasure. If you think you want to get slapped and you end up not enjoying it, you were wrong about the structure of the world in your body from which this phenomenon emerges. You were not wrong about what this is. This is manifest only now. It confirms itself as unpreferable only now in the experience, not in the language, and that changes how you perceive moving forward. But what about where preferences conflict? Well, they conflict because my internal and yours do not overlap completely. I might want to get to the tasty dumplings before you, and slapping you out of the way may produce great joy, ecstasy in me, while it produces humiliation and wailing in you. I can grant, Alex, that the moral plane which deontologists typically imply is incoherent, but it's not incoherent because that which is desirable can be undesirable, or that which is painful can be pleasurable. No. This is like saying blackness can be white, light can be dark. The thing about these words, preference, pain, pleasure, is that they are the words we use to describe this fundamental place of phenomena or value. Things like blue or red are simple phenomena. Things like pain or pleasure are the phenomena of value attached phenomena. A materialist says pain and pleasure are material things. Alex says they are preferential things. But all of us must acknowledge that they are first and foremost value things. They are only directly knowable as value things. If I'm a brain in a vat, a butterfly's dream, I can misperceive what causes pain, what matter is, how it all functions, but I can't confuse maximal pain for something more valuable than maximal pleasure. We hesitate to tip into the sphere of value language because we feel like we have to ground it in something that overarches it, but we don't. This is what value describes, and there's no alternative description. Again, to paraphrase Harris, if it means anything, it must mean this. And if we're discussing what we ought do, and we decide that this term means nothing, then we just need to invent new words to capture our new understanding of how reality is, and then we'll march forward and determine what we should do, how we should govern ourselves according to these new words, in exactly Harris's way or whatever way. So if ought and should and good and evil have too much of a religious or dogmatic tang for Alex, we could invent new words, grot and snud and sud and bleevil. But the only thing we can ever do with them is affirm that this is base reality, is the only thing that can truly be known. This is what Peterson means when he says the world is made of meaning or value.
I'm not an atheist anymore because I don't look at the world that way anymore. I'm not a materialist anymore. I don't think the world's made out of matter. I think it's made out of what matters. It's made out of meaning. Look at it from the perspective of modern brain science. What we orient towards unconsciously, which means what captures our attention, is meaning, and it captures our attention before we know what it is. The brain acts.
This is what he's getting at when he appeals to Sam by saying well-being isn't a fact. Remember how music cannot be directly known without being experienced? Did I talk about that this video? Or is it still coming? Well, well-being, which is what morality pursues, cannot be known without being experienced. And in being experienced, it confirms itself as well-being.
And it doesn't do it on a one-to-one basis because there are more patterns, more facts, than there are motor outputs. So what has to happen is this tremendous plethora of facts that surrounds us has to be filtered to the point where you pick a single action, because you can't act otherwise. And so the mechanism that reduces the number of facts to the selected action is the mechanism that mediates between facts and values. And it's not simply in and of itself, it's a fact that exists, but it isn't a simple, that what it does isn't a simple fact.
As that which is to be pursued by beings that conceive of pursuit or non-pursuit. We're describing morality here. If morality means anything, it means this. Again, to paraphrase Sam, this is just a brute feature of reality, of what it's like to have an experience. This is where I think the more rationally minded or analytically minded skeptics tend to bounce off the main truth. It's not a truth of math or numbers. It's this truth. It's the truth of wistfulness, of blackness being blackness, whether or not my eyes are closed or I'm in a cave. I would suggest here that the Easterner, sitting and simply letting experience flow without judgment or narrative, the Easterner is observing a fundamental part of reality, the only directly knowable feature of reality, with a bit more clarity than if we were to attach language to it. It's actually the skeptic that loses grip here because we hang all these words onto experience and feel like they somehow make it more malleable, less verifiable, more abstract. But experience, as the least abstract thing, is the thing words are least capable of capturing accurately. We feel, because of our religious past, because of our analytic philosophy, because of the laws of logic, whatever, that morality must have some sort of weight or evidence that transcends phenomenology. It has to be like math. We need something to give a design to us, a God from which matter flows according to a wish, and that makes it somehow legitimate because we are these like littler, lesser creations experiencing according to the design of a great creation. Now, don't get bogged down by language. Remember, language dilutes or takes the direct knowledge out of this. Value emerges here and grounds itself, and well-being, say, is the term we use to describe that ultimate ground in which all other value things are rooted. Only oughts or ought-nots that remain to ever discuss are these, self-evident and self-grounding. There is no coherent conception of an ought or an ought-not beyond this. There is no coherent conception of free will. What we can mean by free must mean other things. What we can mean by morality must mean other things. Now, Alex may say, that's not what people feel or think they feel when appealing to a god or whatever, and I agree, but that's an illusion of perception, of language, not of the actual ground nature of being. We can say something is a white blackness or a truthful lie, but any confusion over these is because of how we look at things and how we expect them to be able to be. The confusion inside us does not cause existence itself to change its nature when we actually experience the way things are. So preference is preference and can only ever be. The only sort of thing an ought can ever be exists in this value space, and this value space is what grounds preference. Therefore, we ought only ever maximize preference, and ought can mean no other thing. Now, is it an objective sort of thing? Well, it exists concretely in the phenomenological domain. It can never be otherwise. It cannot be a material thing. No alternative sense of the word ought can ever be meaningful. We're dancing around with words at this point. This is what we are. Any conscious being anywhere, if consciousness is what we mean by consciousness, will only be able ever to desire that which is defined as desire. Any contradiction is a contradiction of language, not being. When we say pushing me off a cliff is bad, I would claim that we're wrapping a lot of propositions up in that. We are saying, I have this body, evolved on this earth with a gravity that is a falling off place. I have brittle bones. Pushing me off this falling off place will cause me to strike the bottom and experience that which is not to be desired by any being capable of experience. Any contradiction or disagreement must posit an alternative reality in which the phenomenon of pleasure is more realized even when you do push me off this cliff. Your pleasure, my pleasure. If we're discussing what we ought to do, you can only appeal to these things. Expand it to a civilization, maybe I would grow up to kill people, so it's best to eliminate me early. You're talking about more pleasure. Expand that to aliens. Maybe I would grow up to design FTL travel, causing devastation to 37 other species, sentient species in the universe. You're talking about more pleasure. Expand it to God, a God that just wants certain things. You're talking about more pleasure. The point is you're taking the place of God in this and trying to imagine a conception or use of morality, meaning, value, somehow divorced from the phenomenological, so you can make it objective, or what I would call material. It's not a material thing. It exists concretely, the only sort of way it can exist. So take the beings out, try to connect it to the laws of nature, and you get matter, and you get nothing. No conversation, no experience of pain or pleasure, no symbols by which to represent them, certainly no aim or value. You just get particles cascading. That's not a challenge of morality. That's a refusal to acknowledge the grounding in the phenomenological that is our being. If you reject that, you reject the entire shindig of being, because that's what being is. It's the consciousness embodied in the material, following the material rules. Don't get confused by language and symbols. Don't get confused by language or symbol. Don't get confused by language or symbol. So when I say pushing me off a cliff is wrong, it's a shorthand proposition regarding the structure of all these things external to me, stretching back in time, the structure of me, the experience that will emerge. If that proposition takes enough things accurately into account, it is an accurate or correct proposition. This is the thing. An ethical statement is not only a proposition in the propositional knowledge way of 2 + 2 is 4. It's an assertion regarding the flowing experience of being, which, as it manifests, is either desirable or undesirable. It's an assertion that, if we follow this in this instance, being will be experienced as better in the only way it can ever be experienced at all, by a being capable of knowing better and worse. This is the procedural knowledge Vervaeke talks about. P.F. Jung talked about it in a recent video. To know better and worse, to know pleasure and pain. When we make an ethical statement, we are simply describing through symbol our state of anticipation or desire concerning how that knowledge flows.